показывать себя такими, какими мы есть.
The way to counter Russia is
Be ready.
strength.
Everyone's white, and that's it. Where's everybody else? And I promised myself
Change
I'd
can
fight
happen
for
in an instant.
equality the rest of my life.
Politics in Kenya has been
Check
around people
on the
who have
BBC
brands.
weather app.
Either your father was this or your father was that.
When big names talk, they talk to the BBC.
Hello, I'm Ben Boulos. You're watching The Context on BBC News. The US Secretary of State says Israel must resolve the conflict with the Palestinians and underlines Washington's support for a two-state solution. Antony Blinken's visit to the region is happening during one of the worst waves of violence in decades, with more than 22 people killed in the last week alone. Britain's Prime Minister says he acted pretty decisively in sacking Nadeem Zahawi as he defends his handling of the affair. The Kremlin rejects claims by Boris Johnson that President Putin threatened him with a missile strike before Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Tonight, with The Context, the Emmy-nominated journalist Caroline Modarressi-Tehrani and Seb Payne, director of the centre-right think tank Onward. Hello, very warm welcome to the programme. It's good to have you with us. The US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, has urged Israel and the Palestinians to take steps to calm tensions during a spike in violence that has put the region on edge. In the latest incident, just hours before Mr. Blinken was due to arrive in Israel, Palestinian health officials said Israeli forces shot dead a Palestinian man at a military checkpoint in Hebron. The violence was sparked on Thursday when 10 Palestinians were shot dead in the occupied West Bank by Israeli forces. Then, on Friday, 7 Israelis were killed when a Palestinian gunman opened fire outside a synagogue in East Jerusalem. Secretary Blinken has already met Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and will also meet the President of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas. From the very moment Mr. Blinken's plane touched the tarmac, he made it clear that addressing the violence of the last week is at the top of his agenda. Well, joining me now is Nathan Sachs, who is director of the Centre for Middle East Policy at the Brookings Institute, who's also an expert in US-Israel relations. Very good to have you with us on the programme. Is this the most apt time for a visit by the US Secretary of State, or does it really limit what he can actually achieve given the wave of violence? OK, Nathan, thank you. I want to bring in the panel. And Seb, I want to start with you. One of the things that I touched on in the introduction to that was some of the Israeli government's wider plans at overhauling the judiciary, giving the parliament greater powers to strike down rulings by the Supreme Court. And yet there were protests by Israelis in large numbers in Tel Aviv against those plans. Do you think the Israeli government has the public mood accurately gauged, or do you think it may have realised it's out of step with that? OK, we'll say goodbye to Nathan for the moment. Nathan Sachs from the Brookings Institute, thanks very much for your contribution. Caroline and Seb, thank you for yours. Don't go away, though, we will come back to the panel a little later. In the meantime, though, let's take a look at some of the other stories that are making headlines today. The authorities in Pakistan say almost 60 people have been killed by an explosion at a mosque in the city of Peshawar in the northwest of the country. More than 150 others were injured. Early reports said a bomber sitting in the front row had blown himself up, but this has not been confirmed. Many of the victims are reported to be police officers. British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak is under pressure from opposition parties who are asking why it took him so long to sack Nadeem Zahawi as Conservative Party chairman. Mr. Zahawi was fired yesterday when an inquiry found that he failed to disclose a tax investigation. An independent report concluded that Mr. Zahawi had repeatedly broken the ministerial code. Labour's chair, Annalise Dodds, said the Prime Minister, quote, needed a backbone. Let's bring in Seb on this one. Seb, in a previous life as Whitehall correspondent, was it, for the Financial Times? These kinds of stories, like the Nadeem Zahawi one that I'm sure you've come across before. The Prime Minister insisting he acted pretty decisively. Does it look like decisive action to you? OK, Seb, thank you very much for your take on that. Seb Payne there. Seb mentioned Boris Johnson. Let's talk about him, the UK's former Prime Minister, who's told the BBC that he felt personally threatened by Vladimir Putin in the run-up to the invasion of Ukraine last year. Mr. Johnson said that after he'd visited Kyiv just before Russia's full invasion, he received a telephone call from the Russian president, in which Vladimir Putin said it would only take a minute to wipe him out with a missile. The claim comes in a new BBC documentary about Mr. Putin's leadership. Here's our diplomatic correspondent, James Landale. Well, that is Boris Johnson's account, but Russia has accused him of lying when he claimed that Vladimir Putin threatened him personally. And the official readouts of the call from both Downing Street and the Kremlin had no mention of the threat. We're joined by Russia expert James Nixey, who is the director of the Chatham House Russia and Eurasia programme. James, the thing that slightly confuses me about this is Russia's rebuttal of the claim, and yet they don't seem to have any problem issuing very thinly veiled hints and threats about being prepared to use nuclear weapons, for example. Why are they so fussed about this claim that Boris Johnson is making? OK, I'm going to bring in the panel now, James. And Caroline, we'll come to you first on this one. There's another element in the documentary which outlines how the then UK Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace, flew to Moscow to meet his Russian counterpart. And Mr. Wallace said that the way the conversation went, he felt that he was witnessing a demonstration of bullying or strength, which was, he felt the Russian defence minister at the time was saying, effectively, I'm going to lie to you. You know I'm lying to you. I know you know I'm lying. I'm still going to lie to you. It makes the whole process of the diplomacy sound like something of a charade that, you know, is never going to achieve anything.
The Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace, who said we need to push back against that. OK. Seb, we're coming to the end of this half hour, so I'll thank you, thank Caroline, and thank you to James Nixey as well from Chatham House. Don't go away, we'll have more coming up for you in just a few minutes.
Hello there. We started the week off on a fine note. Plenty of sunshine up and down the country today. The cloud.
BBC News Live.
As Ukraine
wherever
endures a
you
power
are.
crisis,
Stay up to date.
join our teams
whatever
bringing
you're
you
up
the
to.
latest developments in this
Download the
war.
BBC
This
News
hospital
app.
has been without heating for almost a week.
Those people who are still staying in the town are too afraid to go out.
There's no power here. People, they just pass you like shadows.
See the headlines
Change
as
can
they
happen
happen
in an
breaking
instant.
news alerts in the app. And get the full story with bbc.com/news.
Check
Follow the
on the
story
BBC
for all the
weather app.
latest with BBC News.
Hello, I'm Ben Boulos. You're watching The Context on BBC News. Calls for action on Capitol Hill following the death of Tyree Nichols at the hands of 5 police officers. But will Congress act? Almost 3 years since the death of George Floyd, there has been no political agreement on policing reform. With African nations owing China a combined $160 billion, the US has warned countries to be wary of racking up too much Chinese debt. We asked one regional expert if they really should be worried. And the nomination that has Hollywood talking, Andrea Riseborough's Oscars nod for Best Actress, is to be reviewed by the Academy. Tonight with The Context, the Emmy-nominated journalist Caroline Modarressi-Teherani and Seb Payne, director of the centre-right think tank Onward. Hello, welcome to the programme. The US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen's 10-day visit to Africa has come to an end, but not before drawing the ire of Beijing. During a speech in the Zambian capital, Lusaka, last week, Ms. Yellen called on China to agree to renegotiating Zambia's debt payment deadlines. She said China is a barrier to ending Zambia's debt crisis. Zambia, Africa's second largest copper producer, defaulted on its debt in 2020. It owes more than a third of that debt, some $6 billion, to China. But it's not the only one. China is Africa's second biggest lender, totaling 160 billion US dollars. Most of it is to Angola, Ethiopia, Kenya, Nigeria, and Zambia. And it's not just Africa. Globally, China provided 60% of debt relief. Deborah Browtingham is the director of the China-Africa Research Initiative at the Johns Hopkins University. How worried should those countries be, do you think? Let's bring in the panel at this point. Seb, if I can bring you in at this point with this one. I mean, some people in those African countries where they're seeing the crippling debt repayments that the countries are unable to meet, they may say, well, actually part of the problem is the strength of the US dollar. And yes, the Federal Reserve in the US is focused on reining in inflation in the US, but with interest rates going up, the dollar strengthening, it just makes any debt denominated in dollars more expensive and more of a burden for them to try and repay. Okay, Caroline, thank you. And Seb, thank you as well. We'll return to you in a moment. But thank you also to Deborah Browtingham from the Johns Hopkins University.
You're welcome.
An officer has been suspended over the death of Tyree Nichols in Memphis, the sixth to face action following the death of the 29-year-old black man earlier this month. The other 5 officers that were fired initially have all been charged with murder, with shocking footage released over the weekend showing the group kicking and beating Mr. Nichols as he called for help. The swift actions of the Memphis Police Department in sacking and charging the officers and disbanding the so-called Scorpion Special Unit they belong to has been praised. But lawmakers on Capitol Hill have been anything but swift. Robert Klemko is a reporter for The Washington Post covering policing and criminal justice reform. Robert, are you surprised that now almost 3 years on from the death of George Floyd and the wave of public anger about that we saw, that in legal terms, federally, very little has changed? Okay, Seb, I'm going to start with that only because I want to leave time for the panel. We'll say goodbye to Robert Klemko from The Washington Post. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And now it is time for the panel. So this is a chance for the panel to put a story out there that has caught their eye. Seb, we'll start with you.
At their expense, who knows? We'll find out tomorrow.
I'm sorry, just as with the Oscars, when the music starts playing, it's time for us to stop talking. So we must end it there. Caroline Modarassi Tehrani and Seb Payne, thank you for being with us on The Context. And thank you for watching. See you next time. Bye-bye.
Hello there. We started the new week off on a fine note. Up and down the country on Monday, we saw